Okay, it's now being recorded. Hello, everyone. This is the first of the Cluster API provider vSphere meeting, bi-weekly meeting. We created this time slot last week, but apparently there is some conflicts with some other meetings that other people want to join this one. So I might put out a poll out there just to see what time it works best for everybody. Right now, I think we have to move this time. So if anybody has a suggestion for time, go ahead and put it on the Cluster API Slack channel, and then I'll put out a poll for that. Okay, let me go ahead and share my screen here. Why is it not giving me an option to share my screen? Oh, okay, here we go. Okay, can you guys see the screen right here? So this is the document that I created just for this meeting. I put a couple of agenda items for this week. And if anybody else wants to put any other agendas on here, go ahead and type it in. I have this attendees section in case external people are going to join. We'll find out. I'll advertise this meeting at tomorrow's cluster lifecycle and Wednesday cluster API meetings. So the three agenda items I wanted to discuss. Let's go ahead and start with the first one. And the first one is the external cluster creation workflow. Tim, I forgot to invite you to a meeting that we had last week. It was initially just for the CNX team, but we invited people from other teams to join. And one of the comments that we got about the cluster API at the moment is that the whole Bootstrap workflow, other teams did not like that workflow. They didn't feel that it was robust enough where you had to create a Bootstrap cluster using kubeadm or an existing cluster. And then from the Bootstrap cluster, we would have to then deploy the actual cluster and then pivot from the Bootstrap to the actual cluster. So one of the things I put out on the forum, on the Google group, was the idea of, if you look at the workflow when you do a cluster create, up until the pivot point, the pivoting to the actual cluster, it seems like all of that should be customizable, and maybe what we can do is have a mechanism where we call out to the provider to do whatever it takes to get the what they call the internal cluster up and going. So by the time that we do the pivot, that internal cluster would have already been created, but it doesn't require us to have an existing cluster or a Minikube cluster. We can have something like a common pattern that we have in VMware is to have an OVA that deploys a API server, and that API server can then create the internal cluster, and then we can do the pivot from that point. So that's what I'm thinking, and I haven't responded. I saw that there were 2 comments on there, and I haven't responded to it yet, but I will respond to it soon. What are people's opinion out there on this idea? Anybody?
Yeah, this is Ferran.
Yeah.
Look, to me, it makes a lot of sense, especially if we think about how PKS is working. And I don't know if in the future we want to leverage a cluster API. So having something that does not require you to have an existing Kubernetes cluster on a mini kube. So having something that we can just bootstrap as a, I don't know, as a Linux process, and from that being able to spin up new Kubernetes cluster, this is something that is really compelling for us.
Okay.
I read Jessica Chen comment on the mailing list, and I was going to reply to her. Just it seems that he thought about that approach, but they had some, some problems with what they call the clusterctl precursor GCP deployer. So I'm wondering what kind of problems did they run into when they used
Which
the approach.
who had the problem with it?
Jessica Chen.
Okay.
Is one of the ladies that replied to your email.
Yeah.
Well, it's the same, right? She replied 2 times. And the second time, she said that they thought about that and she recommends against it. Is it on her experience?
Okay. Anybody else has any comment on this approach?
So this is Siddharth. So I'd like to second the fact that, if there is a way for not having that initial cluster as a prerequisite, I mean, so the current Minikube implementation that the cluster API has, where it, kind of almost from the user's perspective is kind of opaque. So the end user who is using the clusterctl command, for example, does not, visually see the underlying Minikube coming up and doing all the job, and it goes away automatically. Is okay, but essentially if we can completely even avoid that, since these are just controllers, that means we should be able to run them as a service. So yeah, I mean, but to the point that what Farhan mentioned, right, we probably want to talk to Jessica to see what kind of pitfalls and issues that they ran into. Because from our perspective, if you were to think about from vSphere, right, I mean, it's very simple to, have the service, interact with a YAML file as an input, which it is today at the moment, and be able to realize that into the vSphere environment with creating instances and anything additional around that we need. We'll be able to create that. So.
Okay.
Yeah, another comment about that is that, as far as I know, and correct me if I'm wrong, clusterctl is not something that is mandatory, right? So the only thing that that SIG is going to define is the cluster API specification, period. So it's up to the different providers to use the clusterctl or not. Is that correct, or?
That is correct. We can actually create our own CTL. There was a there was a kickoff for the AWS provider design work last week. I wanted to attend that, but I couldn't. And there was a company that was they had their own CTL command line to CLI that they were considering contributing to the AWS provider effort. I don't know what happened with that. I need to read the notes on that. But yes, we can create our own CTL CLI, and maybe that's what we should do.
So just to clarify, so it seems that the SIG, what is going to define is just the cluster API specification and some kind of interface for the cluster machine actuator. Is that all what they are going to define, or?
Can you repeat that again?
So exactly the cluster, the cluster API SIG, what is going to define? What is going to be the outcome? Is just the cluster API specification and the cluster machine actuator interface? Is that all, or?
I didn't completely understand your question, but let me see if I can kind of explain what I was thinking. I was thinking that we expand out the cluster actuator interface, and then we create new APIs that would help create that initial internal cluster. Does that kind of answer your question, or did I answer the wrong question?
No, it was asking something like that. So it was going to, what I'm trying to figure
How about
out
this? How about
is,
this, Farhan? We all have the ability to edit this document. So if you want to, you can edit this document and then put in your question that way. Then it will be easier for me to understand.
okay, sure.
Hey, look,
And
I was not able to edit the document, so I'm
yeah,
not sure what's the process. I am part of the mailing list, so do I have to request access?
There was a link in. Did you join the Slack channel? There's the internal Slack channel for VMware. The Kate's. Let me just go ahead and invite you.
I think I'm part of it.
Okay, so there, I have a link that is that's pinned to this channel.
that link is logged. That link is actually gives us only a view only mode. I think maybe there's some finer sharing setting that you might have to tweak on the.
Okay, let me fix this right now.
Yeah, I wanted to add the attendees in other sections, but couldn't.
And okay, so maybe while you're doing that, so let me try and, based on my understanding, I can try and answer Farhan's question. I think from what at least I understood. So Farhan, my understanding so far is the cluster CTL at this point in time is pretty much the only mechanism or the tool which gets you the cluster API add-on or the extension getting registered. So right before the pivot, right, they do the registration of this extra like this custom this additional controllers onto the target cluster. So that part essentially, I think, ideally can be taken out, but I don't believe that is readily available outside, that you can just take a YAML and say kubectl apply this YAML file and that will start that controller literally on your cluster, for example. I don't think that's there yet. I could be wrong, but that's my understanding so far. And it's kind of buried inside that cluster CTL tool today, at least as of now. But from a long term, I guess, I mean, I would imagine that, cluster API, it should be, as you said, it's just a definition of the API specification of what these objects are. That is really what the contract is, that this, that should probably what this should be coming out of this cluster API.
Okay, thanks.
So I just shared the editable link, which by the way, the GitHub page for this project has a link to this document also. And I'm not sure if it has been updated yet, and I'm not sure if it has the editable version, but I will make the changes once we get off this meeting. I'm not going to do that right now. I'll do that afterwards. So are there any other possible ideas on this topic? I think it's a good path to go forward. I think also one of the benefits of doing something like with the OVA approach is that we can save the logs, and we can. I think it might provide us with better debugging if we went with this approach.
I'm trying to understand if it makes sense even for WCP.
By the way, don't mention that we don't have to mention projects or teams in the company. We can just say projects. This is a meeting that's public.
Okay, thanks.
I'm curious if folks have seen anything for a pattern, if y'all are talking to other cloud providers, if there's a common pattern that might evolve out here that would make sense to be aligned with.
I don't know about the AWS one, and I'm going to review their initial design spec. But the only other one that I know of that's a full one right now is the GCE one, and it also creates a Minikube cluster or tries to use an existing cluster. So I'm not sure if the other cloud provider has a concept of using an OVA for a API server like VMware does. But I think we can start this discussion and maybe provide a pattern that other cloud provider can use. This discussion, we can do it on a Google group. And I do believe that this should be the way that the create workflow works. There should be some way to allow us to allow all the different cloud providers to do some experimentation. Right now, it forces us to either use a existing cluster or a Minikube cluster, and I think that's an area that more ideas can come out if we have the ability for that create workflow to call out to the cloud providers to do their own thing. So are there any other ideas on this topic, or should we move on?
This is Giri. I have a question on the OVA. I'm not sure if you mentioned this earlier. I know for vSphere users, OVA has been something very comfortable to use. Are we looking at the actual operating system itself? I mean, what is the OS that is going to run inside? Are we going to be recommending a bunch of images to run the custom API server? Or is it something like, when I go to the project, I will be able to get a copy of an OVA that I can download and then deploy?
That is a good question. I don't know the answer to that. Yeah, that's a question that I can't answer. Can you update the document with your question?
Yeah, because the reason is
Thanks.
we can maybe sort of treat this as an init script for OVA. Let user download this package and let them use whatever image that they want to use. One way to trigger that script can be an OVF property. That burden we can give it to whoever's packaging the project. But
so if you would please add your question and I'll answer it the way that I'll tell you the way that Vic does it. Okay, so the build process for Vic actually goes through and creates the a series of ISOs and maybe. But that doesn't answer the question for OVA. Never mind. This is something we have to look into. Okay. I don't know the answer to that.
Hello. Do you think it's going to be better to not create a separate version of cluster cutoff or basically a new CLI here? Instead, coordinate with the cluster API SIG and pretty much extend cluster kernel to support all the cloud providers.
That's what I would prefer. I would prefer that this is a pattern that's built into cluster cutoff, that we can extend it. All the steps in the workflow up to the pivot, I would like that to be able to call the cloud provider, and then the cloud provider can figure out how to create the initial internal cluster. But I've only started working with this project for the last 2 weeks, so I don't know how willing the rest of the working group and the SIG are to changing that workflow.
Yeah, because essentially this is going to create fragmentation if everybody decides to spin their own CLI.
I agree. I would rather put it into the cluster cuddle. And the way I look at it is everything up to the pivot how that internal cluster is created shouldn't, that shouldn't be inflexible. How that gets created, I don't think it's actually part of the benefit of the cluster API. That's so everything up to the pivot, I think, is an area that where every vendor can best optimize and experiment with.
Yeah, oftentimes it's better to give the political path a shot, basically.
Yeah, yeah, and I agree. And since you've been working with this, these guys a lot more, maybe you can help convince them that this is.
Yeah, so I've been following the cluster API for quite some time, but I mean, there's so many opinions and decision making in there that it's quite political, so I tend to stay aside. But if you have a specific topic, I guess I can bring it up.
I'll bring it up in tomorrow's meeting and in Wednesday's meeting, and we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, just add it to the agenda document.
Yeah, I did. I have already added it to the agenda.
Okay, okay.
Okay, so why don't we move on to the next topic? So the cluster API, let's see. So this is a question I asked last week about is there any intention for the cluster API to do things like set up the networking and storage subsystem, and someone else also brought up the topic of what about monitoring and logging subsystems, everything that makes a cluster production ready. And the answer I get back for, at least for the networking and storage, is that's not really in the purview of the cluster API. What was recommended, it was that if we want to do that, we can create a sub-config spec in the cluster spec that is vendor specific. Now, they didn't say that this would be the case forever. If there seemed to be a lot of support from other vendors, especially the CNI vendors that were on the call, to add this ability in. And what we can do is that we can start it off as vendor specific config, and then over time maybe refactor it into the higher level cluster API. This is a question for especially members of other teams who have a need to deploy other subsystems like network overlays. What do you think about this approach that they have recommended? Was it clear with what I was talking about, or?
Yes, at least to me, because I was kind of part of that conversation back then when you had that. So I think, I mean, the general idea of, maybe starting off as that a provider specific, description, provider specific input coming in at the cluster level and creating that and realizing that networking stack if we need to, is probably, I think it's a fair enough and a good start. And, we can probably over time work with the other, maybe the cluster API, as well as we can also look at the other cloud providers as well and try and coordinate maybe along with them. Because, for example, simple example being, the choice of different CNIs that you want to run on your cluster, right? I mean, I'm sure it's not, so those CNI choices are not only specific to VMware, they're specific to just the n number of choices, and the customers should have a choice. You should have an option to select which CNI, for example, they want to deploy, regardless of the cloud provider even, right? So I think maybe this may be like a good starting point to say, in order to seed that, we can start with here. But let's have that conversation upstream to say with the other SIGs as well, other cloud providers specifically, to say, okay, you know what, how are they planning on handling this case? And if we can all come to a similar solution across cloud providers, even that will be better.
Yeah, I think VMware it's just a little bit of a special case. At least some of the other cloud provider, some of the public clouds, they might have a one mechanism to do networking and for storage, and I think you just use that approach by default. There's no setting up of there may be less setting up of those subsystems, whereas like for VMware, setting up something like NSX may require significant amount of work, and I don't know how much of that is configurable via some kind of config. So I brought up this page. I hope everybody can see it. So this is the cluster YAML file, and what they're suggesting is under this provider config, we create our own config that allows us to set up other subsystems like NSX. So Farhan, you're working on a product that requires setting up NSX. What is your thoughts on this approach?
To be honest, I don't know yet.
Can you do that with just a spec in this? Is that even possible?
It's possible. It's possible if we specify all of the required input parameters in the provider config. But as I believe it was Sihar who was talking before me, I'm not sure what is, we can end having each provider having duplicate code in the sense, I don't know, just for example, the CNI plugins that you want to configure. So I'm wondering if we can find some kind of a minimum or common abstraction layer that is going to be helpful for all of the different providers versus each provider setting up each own configuration. When you talk about NSX right now, it works only on vSphere, right? But the team is testing that, and this is public. We are testing that on Azure as well. So it's not something that is going to be specific to the vSphere cloud provider. It may work as well on the Azure cloud provider, for example. So I don't have a strong opinion yet on that.
Okay.
I think there's a little bit more clarification that I wanted to add here. So when you think about networking, there are actually two levels of networking that we're talking about, and maybe it would be important or beneficial is to kind of distinguish between the two. One is the networking that you set up as an underlay for the infrastructure VMs itself, right? Which could be like the NSX network or like a simple vSphere network or whatever that may be. And the second is the container networking, for example, which is like, okay, implementing a specific choice of the CNI that will be then operating inside the, inside the Kubernetes cluster. So I think in a general, even for the vSphere cloud provider, we have multiple combinations and choices of both of them that will come up. So we have to get a way, and I think from the getting the commonality aspect of it, I think for the CNI part, that there is a good chance that we should be able to coordinate with the other cloud providers as well to say, from the CNI perspective, there is a good common area that we can deal it in the same way. And of course, for the underlay part, yes, there, as you said, there will be slightly difference, and there will be like maybe a VMware specific thing because it has to deploy NSX or any other combination, which might have to just keep it within the provider. Maybe.
Okay, so I'm going to add our experience on VIC. Before we had the OVA approach, the way that you deploy a VIC virtual container host was to use the VIC machine CLI. And one of the problems that we've had on our team, and customers have also complained about this, was that the number of command line options to set up all the components for the VCH was daunting. Now, if we were to set up everything from the CNI to CSI to the monitoring subsystem and the logging subsystem in here, I'm afraid that the parameters would be so long that nobody will ever do it. And that's my concern about putting all of the parameters for setting those subsystem up in this provider config. So what we did for Vic that helped things a lot was to create the OVA, and the OVA would bring up UI wizards that would walk the customer through the process instead of requiring them to list all the parameters out. And that actually goes well with the previous conversation we had about changing the cluster creation workflow. If we had something like an OVA, we could walk the customer through the users. I would just rather say users right now instead of customers. Users through all the parameters to set up the all the subsystems. And I think we can use the provider config to put all the parameters in, but if we just required users to put all the parameters in the provider config, I'm afraid no one's going to do it.
Yeah, you raised a good point here with the two different layers. One is the configuring the infrastructure layer. Another one is what is going to be inside the Kubernetes cluster. It is, for example, the CNI plugins, right? When I think about that, and just looking at the examples, and especially when we look at that cluster.yaml file, to me it seems more that this is just going to configure the infrastructure layer, not what is going to be inside the cluster. But because just looking at the examples, we have another one that is the provider components, right? And this is where you are going to configure exactly how the internal components are going to work. So maybe we're trying to solve something that, we think that everything should be on the cluster.yaml, and that's not exactly true. We cannot split that configuration based off if it's going to be part of the infrastructure or it's going to be part of the Kubernetes cluster.
Okay. Can you, Farhan and Siddharth, can you add your comments in the section? Can you edit the document and add those?
Sure. Sure.
By the way, you can type at the same time I'm typing.
Yeah, I was wondering if I add a new line after you.
No, it works. It actually works pretty well. Google Docs does a really good job of synchronization.
Okay,
it's amazing.
I think maybe we can at least start discussing maybe the next point if we don't have anything.
Okay, yeah, let me just finish this one sentence and then we'll move on.
Sure.
Okay, so the next topic is dealing with Terraform versus GoVMami. So the existing vSphere cloud provider, cluster API cloud provider, was written by other people outside the company. I believe it might have been written by some people at Google. But the current provider uses Terraform. And Terraform is another product that underneath actually uses Go vMami. So the question I have is, should we switch over to Go vMami? And the second question is, can we switch over to Go vMami? Because if other products, by the way, can we all mute just so that I hear somebody typing? The reason why I ask if we can switch over is because if other companies have upcoming product that intends to use this cloud provider that's written with Terraform, there might be some issues, and I don't know what is the right way to find out what upcoming product from other companies are using the current vSphere provider. I have tried to ping the guys at Google who I believe might have written the initial version of the vSphere provider, but I haven't gotten any response. Talking to Fabio, he believes that we can go ahead and just replace Terraform with Go vMami. Does anyone have any opinions on this topic?
I think with respect to, the cluster API would be in Go, I think. And invoking Terraform from there would be an anti-pattern. So probably switching and using Go vMami directly might be a better approach. Also,
okay, so let me ask you this. Why do you believe it would be better? I have my opinions, but I want to hear other opinions on why you believe it would be better.
Well, you're changing the format. I think, how do we invoke Go vMami from cluster API? So we would have to invoke Terraform CLI, right? Or we'll have to include Terraform script.
Yes.
And from there, we would again call Go vMami. So if you are, the idea is to target the Go, then why not just directly call the libraries that we need to?
So the one argument for not switching over is that this provider already exists. Why rewrite something just so that we use a different APIs?
There is one.
Well, I guess one reason is to minimize the number of moving parts and security exposures. So if Terraform calls Go vMami anyway, and you can take it out and get the same functionality, why not do it? You've got less to ship, less to worry about.
There are a lot of functionalities that are not exposed in Terraform. As Steve was mentioning, Terraform actually uses Go vMami to talk to vSphere anyway. There are tons of API calls that are not bubbled up in Terraform that we might, end up using, especially things that are, given that we're talking about provisioning, Go vMami is going to be, is going to be the first thing that will be updated for new API, things like instant clone or, new features in vSphere that we can actually use to, make it faster, make it better. If we end up, sticking with Terraform, we'll have to wait until these new functionalities, new features will bubble up into Terraform. So it's I think it's a layer of abstraction we don't really need, because if we were doing something that was cross-platform, so not targeting just vSphere, but like targeting vSphere and other platforms at the same time, might have been a much better choice to stick with Terraform. But given that we're targeting just vSphere specifically, I think just going with plain old Go vMami is probably the best way to go.
In terms of trying to identify future users of this, I wouldn't bother, but I would be concerned about any switch breaking known existing ones. And you can see evidence of what people are using out there to some extent by just looking in the Kubernetes Slack. So I know for a fact people are using our cloud provider with OpenShift because I see questions about it every couple of weeks on the Kubernetes Slack. So it's known to be out there. It's known there are people just using kubeatom. We've heard from the Gartner group in our Kubernetes SIG. So I don't think they actually support it yet. So that would be a future, but I'd be more worried about existing Kubernetes distros and not so much about ones we don't know about.
So
Okay.
how is the rest of the community doing it? Other cloud providers which are already into Terraform.
So we're the only cloud provider for the cluster API that uses Terraform. The one for GCE calls their APIs directly. I don't know about AWS yet. So that's a interesting point of information.
OpenStack also uses the API. I can tell you about that.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, one other point just to add on to the list of maybe why we should, for Terraform. So Terraform is good as a tool when you want to quickly deploy a number of things. However, one of the downside of Terraform being you don't get the fine-grained control if you want to. The moment you want to get a fine-grained control over the resource that it created, you just don't have that. I mean, you either deal them in totality or not. That's it. So that's if you were to maintain the life cycle of the entire cluster over a long period of time, at times you will find yourself into a situation where you want to fine-tune one aspect of a VM. For example, maybe just reconfigure that VM for a certain property. Just making up thing here, but something to anything like that. If you were to use Terraform, then you are kind of will not be able to do that, number one. And even if you do out of band, something changes to the VM, and Terraform, when you run it again, it detects that it's going to delete and recreate again. So, so there's again, so I think if you have to go with like final control, number one, then we should go with Go vMommy. The second point that I want to bring up is with Terraform, one of the other sticking point is the state. Like now you have a Terraform state file that gets generated, and then you have to now babysit that as a source of truth for Terraform to operate on. And that becomes another layer of things that you have to worry about from persistence point of view. However, if you're dealing with Go vMommy, I mean, we can try and intelligently utilize the existing vSphere APIs itself to save as much information as we can, or in a way, I would say is like if you were to, let's say, just recreate the state from VC, you should be able to do that with Go vMommy in a much more lighter fashion, as opposed to if it were to be a Terraform state file, because it's going to be very hard to recreate a Terraform state file if you have lost it, for example. It's going to be difficult, if not impossible.
So I had a question with respect to Terraform bindings. Are these bindings for vSphere or are these bindings for Kubernetes on vSphere?
vSphere.
Yeah, so I don't think us choosing Go vMommy directly impacts the Terraform bindings for vSphere, right? So if any customers are using Terraform right now, it should not impact them. How cluster APIs are interacting with vSphere should not affect the flow, how Terraform interacts with vSphere and how users use Terraform.
No, it's not that they're how users are using Terraform. It's how right now the vSphere cloud provider uses Terraform underneath. So if we switch that out for Go vMommy, it might create some edge case bugs in other people's other companies' products. Was that clear?
Yep, thanks.
Okay, sure. So back onto the adding, I'll add my opinions on why I think we should move over to Go vMommy. What Siddharth said was really, really interesting about the state file. I also think that it would be much easier to debug if we were going directly to an API that we own. And since we're going directly to the vSphere API itself, we don't have to debug. We take one layer out of the debugging stack. You know, we would have to also understand how the way that Terraform works and what some of the operations, if we see a failure, where's the failure occurring? Is it in Go vMame? Is it in vSphere? Or is it in Terraform? And just removing that layer, I think will greatly assist in our debugging process. So on the topic of how do we advertise this, that we're going to do the switch, I was thinking that, you know, I think if we advertise it in all the channels that are available to us in terms of the public forums for the SIG and the working group, I think that should be enough. All right, we'll advertise it in the SIG and working group meetings. We'll advertise it in the Google group discussion board, and then we'll advertise it on the Slacking channel, and then find out if there is if any company out there would be opposed to this, and if there are, then we can work with them directly, and then try to make sure that our changes doesn't affect them. Are there any other ideas on how we can accomplish this? I mean, right now the cluster API is not even in alpha yet. It's not alpha in Kubernetes yet. So I think you know, if we make the switch now, I think we're safe. I think there's only one product that we're all thinking right now that we all suspect is using this this provider that might be affected. And if we advertise it in all the public forums, I think we're covered, right?
Yeah, I think we should test the workflows. Nevertheless, we should have a way to define what we have right now and how it's going to impact, because that questions would come back to us saying, okay, I understand that you're switching, but what's actually going to impact me? That's a question that we need to be ready with an answer.
Yeah, and sometimes we might not know the impact until we actually implement it, which means how, you know. Okay.
I think this brings up the question, we need to establish the testing regarding their cluster API vSphere provider implementation, like a unit test, end-to-end test, to guard their, basically the implementation, whether that's match the original one or not.
Okay, you brought up a great.
Yeah, I don't think we have existing tests right now, right? And we have.
I don't think that there are any testing right now. In fact, a lot of the unit tests are empty. And if you look through the issue board of the cluster API repo, you see that there's a lot of issues asking for people to write some unit tests. So and integration tests. A lot of this has not been implemented yet, testing wise.
Yeah, I think that testing will be critical on the switching.
Anybody else has any comments on the testing? Which, by the way, I want to add that, you know, the repo was just created last week. We don't have any issues written up yet. I'm going to start writing some issues up, some mirrored issues from the cluster API repo into the to the vSphere provider. I'm not mirroring every issue. There are some issues. There's one or two that I believe actually belongs in the provider-specific repo and not in the cluster API. And I'll just start adding some issues into our repo. But for things like testing, Hui, can you review the issue boards for the cluster API and see and evaluate how complete the issues are around testing?
Just review the existing issue regarding the testing and how. Yeah, I can review that.
Can you just dig into that and then come back with maybe in 2 weeks come back with an evaluation of where we are with testing in this around this. And I'll bring this up this week because I'm kind of curious myself and I don't know the answer to this. I don't believe that there are any testing at all yet.
Yeah, that's also my impression. So yeah, I'll dig it and get it back.
Okay. I don't have any other topics. If anybody wants to bring up any topic right now, we can start talking about it. I'll just repeat that the repo was just created. So if there are any topics around the repo, newly created repo, please bring up those, bring up that topic right now. Okay, I guess that means that everybody's pretty happy with the new repo and there's no issues. Okay.
Yay.
So on the repo, I mean, I actually pushed a few like pull requests there. I mean, I'm not sure why they. I mean, I see that they were approved for merging, but I'm not sure. Is there? If you guys can help me, like, is there anything else that I need to do? So if you go to the pull request there.
No, Fabio can jump in on this. He's waiting for the bot to. There's supposedly some bot that runs, and then automatically merges the code. I don't know when those bots run.
Yeah. So here the problem is really just that we need the webhook to point to the Kate's robot. Right now we only have the CLA bot attached to the repo. I'm working with the people in Kubernetes, the people that are managing the Kubernetes SIG org, to see what are the next steps when it comes to joining the repo to the list of repos that are looked after by the bot, and that didn't happen yet. So I can manually merge them if we have like a strict need. I didn't want to mess with the and have like some PRs merged manually and some of them merged with the bot. So I was gonna wait for this week at least to see if we could resolve that. If not, I have the power to merge them manually. So we have a plan B.
Okay, oh, that's great. I mean, I just want to. I wasn't sure if there's anything that I need to do more on that or not. That's why I thought I'll just bring it up here, which is good. I mean, which is okay. If let's say within a week time, if it gets merged with the bots, that's fine.
Okay. With that, unless anybody have any other topics that they want to discuss, we only have 5 minutes left. I think we can end this meeting. I will repeat that I will put up a poll, an initial poll on our internal Slack channel, and then to see what time works best. I will also bring this topic up at the SIG and working group meeting, that I'm going to say, hey, we have this meeting, and here are some times that we have chosen. What are times that work best for you guys? And then hopefully the next meeting in 2 weeks will be at a different time. Okay. Other than that, I think we can stop here. Thanks, guys.
Thanks a lot for driving the meeting.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
guys.
Thank you.